Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, folks. I'm Aaron Keller. I'll be with you for the next few hours here this afternoon as we prepare for what we are told is a verdict in the Roy Oliver case in Texas. Remember, this is the case of a police officer who's accused of shooting and killing a 15-year-old who was a passenger in a vehicle. The question, was this justifiable? Was this shooting something that resulted from the officer believing his fellow officer was in danger during that criminal event that they were called to investigate? Or was this not justifiable? Was it flat out murder, illegal? That's the question jurors have had to grapple with. We heard a little bit earlier this afternoon that jurors had a question in this case that they perhaps were stuck on the justification element. Was this shooting justified? Well, that led rather quickly, we were told, to an announcement that there was a verdict. And what we're seeing now, though, is a lengthy bench conference. I'm wondering exactly what's going on in that courtroom, because normally we would see things happen in a little bit different trajectory if this was indeed a verdict. Is the verdict just simply that they have no verdict? We're waiting to find out the details. Ronn Blitzer is here along with me on the Law and Crime Network. Ron, verdict, no verdict, can we tell from the body language here?
So far, it's hard to say. Yeah, I've been hearing that there was a verdict coming in, but based on what we're seeing now, I wouldn't be surprised if the jury, as you said, was just saying, no, we don't have a decision, and now the judge and the attorneys are trying to figure out where to go from here.
This wouldn't be the first time we've seen jurors come forward and say, well, our verdict is that we're not unanimous. And there is a little bit of confusion. I can understand it. I sat on a jury once years and years and years before I went to law school, and the whole nature of, what form you have to fill out, when you have to hand it in. You have to fill out a verdict form, and then, but you can't tell anyone that. You have to send a note that you've reached a verdict, and then they have to come and get the different form from you. I'm hearing from our producer, Kathy Russin, though, that this is a verdict on all three charges. So which way did they go? That's the question we all want answered.
Yeah. We've seen the evidence in this case. I think that there is a significant amount of evidence against Roy Oliver. However, I thought he did a great job on the stand, really conveying that he personally believed that his partner's life was in danger. So in a case like this, even if there's evidence that goes against him truly being justified objectively, if he subjectively in that moment, based on his training and his experience, felt that this was necessary, that could pose an interesting dilemma for the jury.
Yeah, and the way that this case has been characterized has been tough because, look, at one point he said he thought the car was headed towards either himself or a fellow officer. Well, then the footage comes out and the car is headed away from them, but the car is kind of backing up and then it moves forward and then it turns as it heads away. And in that moment, of course, leading up to that moment, I should say first, there were gunshots, and then right before the shots were fired, there's this breaking of a window. Well, you throw the officer's fear that guns have been fired in the vicinity, within earshot, along with the breaking of a window. Could a reasonable officer have looked at that and said, I think it's the window of that car that's being broken. Someone is going to fire out of that car at me. That's why that car is fleeing. They don't want to get caught. Bam, I have to make a split-second decision.
Yeah. Although at the same time, when he testified, he wasn't really saying that he was afraid that he was going to get shot at so much as he was afraid that the car was going to hit the other officer. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky. But like you mentioned, there was a lot going on. According to him, there had been shots fired. There was a lot of commotion, a lot of people coming out of this house. There was a car that wasn't obeying commands to stop. So even if it was moving and then stopped and then started moving suddenly again in any direction, it could have thrown him off. And, that's why I wouldn't be surprised if he's found not guilty on the murder charge.
Yeah, we're waiting to see how long it's going to take for the judge to wrap this all up and go in and announce this verdict. Well, the judge just took off and left the bench there, so we're waiting to see exactly what we've got here. So we did hear from the judge that there is a verdict on all three charges. While we wait for everyone to get together in the courtroom there in Texas, let's go back and play the recording of this shooting in normal speed so you can listen for yourselves.
Hey, Hamburglar, come here. Have a seat. Where do you go to school?
West Mesquite.
All these West Mesquite kids? Maybe?
Some of them Mesquite Pretty much all the time.
Listen, don't do this again.
Yeah, this is a one-time thing, sir.
Mr. Rhodes, I'm Officer Gross, okay?
Officer Rose.
I don't want to see this again.
Yeah, let me go see this again. I ain't expected to get this
I don't.
tight.
Hey, stop that car! Stop right there! Stop! Stop! Copy 28. Charles Sam 7 Young 882. Charles Sam 7 Young 882. Hey, stop that fucking car! Stop that fucking car right now! That fucking car! You alright? Yeah, fine. You were trying to hit you.
64, Black Cat, southbound, Shepherd, turn on to standby. Station 1.
Stop! Stop!
And that was the chaotic situation in Texas when police officer Roy Oliver pulled the trigger, shooting and killing 15-year-old victim Jordan Edwards. Now, Edwards was a passenger in that vehicle that the officers ordered to stop, and then it was sort of like backing up or trying to get out of this street where apparently traffic was blocked. And then it gets out on the main road, kind of backs up, and then tries to take off going in a forward motion. And in the midst of that turn is when the shots were ultimately fired by Officer Oliver into that vehicle, not hitting the driver, but rather hitting the passenger, Jordan Edwards. We're continuing to monitor that courtroom in Texas because the judge announced that the jurors have indeed reached a verdict on 3 charges against Officer Oliver. We're waiting to see exactly how long it's going to take to get this verdict read. Meanwhile, Ronn Blitzer is here with me still in studio here at the Law and Crime Network. Ron, I always look at that video and I say it's a reminder of how quickly these situations go by in real time, because we read descriptions of them and it seems like it takes forever. Oh, there were minutes upon which this officer could have decided to pull out the weapon, and no, this was split seconds.
Oh, absolutely. And to me, I watched that video, and I don't think it supports what Oliver said on the stand. It shows the car going away. We're limited in what we can see. The lighting is not very good. This happened at night. But to me, if I'm on the jury, I'm saying guilty here. But at the same time, you hear the tone in his voice. He sounds worried. He sounds concerned that something dangerous is going to happen to him or his partner. And it only takes one person on that jury to think, wait, this guy really believed that deadly force was necessary here, and that's all it takes to get him not guilty.
You know, I was looking at this initially and saying I'd have to go with guilty as well, because I don't see that car as an imminent threat. It's at least, at minimum 10 feet away from him. Of course, did he not know exactly where his partner was standing? Could that play into the analysis? And you really have to get into the details here as to exactly who thought what was going to happen next. And, now we've seen it so many times, you could say, well, yeah, the car's just going to drive off down the street. Did he fear that that car was going to lurch forward and then come back around? What direction were the tires pointed until the last minute? It's really hard to tell from the video.
Yeah, it is hard to tell from the video. But based on his testimony, he definitely seemed to have a clear picture of who was where. He was describing where Officer Gross was standing. He was describing his mannerisms and how he approached the vehicle, and then he followed suit. So he seemed to paint a pretty clear picture, and he didn't seem to be fuzzy on any of the details. So for me, it's hard to go with, well, it all happened so quickly, he wasn't sure what was going on. He acts like he knew what was going on. So again, as I was saying, if you believe that, or if one person on that jury believes it, it could be a hung jury in a mistrial.
Yeah, we're waiting to see here, folks. The judge announced that there were verdicts on all 3 counts in the Roy Oliver case. It was an interesting announcement because just moments before that, jurors said they had a question on the underlying charge here and the instructions that they were given. The jurors basically saying, okay, we need to try to figure out what's going on with justification. They had questions about that. So, look, we're going to listen to a little bit more of Roy Oliver's testimony on the witness stand. Again, keep in mind, folks, he's a police officer. His job is to give testimony. He's a trained witness. He's a witness who's probably testified in many, many proceedings before his own. Keep that in mind as we listen to some of what he had to say on the witness stand.
Up against my body for better control.
What happened next?
As I'm getting up to the level part of Shepherd, I'm off bearing. I've gone to elevation. The car is still at the kind of angle on Shepherd.
When you say angle, tell us what you saw. You saw all of this money spent on all of this reverse, whatever it was, and scientific stuff. But what did you see?
I saw the car. It was not running north and south. The street runs north and south. The car had backed up, but had not fully orientated itself to run in the proper manner like it should.
Well, what's the proper manner? What do you mean?
If the street runs north and south, the car should have backed all the way into whichever way it wants to go.
Was there any reason why that car couldn't have kept backing up?
No, it was the majority into the. It was the majority of it was in the northbound lanes, even though the headlights were generally facing south. If he would have stayed in the northbound lanes, there was no obstacles that I recall that it could have just kept backing away from us. No issues, no threat.
And you heard testimony from two guys that said they were up in the parking lot of the nursing home watching all of this. Did you ever hear them scream to you, hey, the guys that did the shooting drove off in a yellow Tahoe?
No. No one from any location flagged me down the assault.
Okay. So I want this jury to know what you saw prior to the time of the shooting.
As soon as I got to level ground, the vehicle came to a stop for a slight moment and then accelerated forward. It was not facing southbound, it was facing south-southwest. It came forward towards my partner, and as it was gaining ground towards him, I had to make a decision. This car's about to hit my partner. There were threats inside the car, and when lethal force is being presented towards us, I had no other option but to use lethal force.
Okay, so that's all great legal terms and everything. Car a deadly weapon?
Car is a deadly weapon.
Do officers know that cars can knock police officers down, run over them, anything else, cause serious bodily injury or death to them?
Yes.
So you saw a deadly weapon as far as you were concerned.
Yes.
Moving towards your partner.
Moving towards my partner.
What did you see though? I mean, we've heard that the wheels were pointed this way and everything because they did all of this math and all that. What did you see?
I am focused on what is moving inside the vehicle. The two silhouettes that I saw, the driver and the passenger. I'm not looking down at the wheels. I'm looking at what's going on inside the vehicle. I'm looking at where my partner is at. He's over here on my peripheral vision. But, I mean, I can see car, occupants of the car, and partner right here. And I see that gap. As soon as the thing went forward, it was coming at an angle at him.
Well, now you heard Dr. Hayden say that you should have been like a rotating beacon, scanning everything, and you should have known exactly what was going on over here. Is that the reality of being involved in a situation like this?
No, in the very beginning, my head was scanning left and right. I'm not going to say it was 180 degrees scanning, but I was scanning as much as I could to try to keep the gross somewhere in my field of view. But once he wasn't just giving commands to cars in general and stuff, once it got specific, once his voice elevated, once you start taking every piece of nugget of information out and start putting all of this together, this became a really volatile situation. That car had plenty of room to just keep going backwards and would be gone.
Do you have any idea who was in that car?
No. No one flagged us down to say who was in the car, what their intentions were, or anything.
Dr. Hayden said it was 9 seconds up to where the shooting actually occurred.
Okay, folks, the judge has said there's a verdict in the Roy Oliver case. There is a verdict on all 3 charges, according to the judge. Interesting, because the jurors just had an issue with justification moments before that. The judge is back on the bench, so let's listen in and try to make sense of this. We are waiting, ladies and gentlemen, to see exactly what's going on here. So this is the Cliff Notes version of the last couple of minutes here. Jurors said that they were not unanimous on the meaning of justification in the Roy Oliver case. This is an officer-involved shooting, a police officer facing murder charges related to the death of a 15-year-old who was a passenger in a vehicle that was leaving a crime scene where officers had been called to investigate reports of underage drinking. So after hearing all the testimony, all the arguments, jurors deliberated and said, we are not unanimous on justification. Then just moments later, the judge came out and said, we have a verdict on the 3 charges jurors have to try to figure out. And the judge has been on the bench, off the bench. Maybe we're bringing jurors in now. Ron, do you care to look into the crystal ball and make any sense of this?
It's anybody's guess right now. But if I'm pressed to make a prediction, I'm going to say guilty.
So you think that there is indeed a verdict?
Yes.
We're just meeting that threshold.
I think there is a verdict here. I think that there was some question, about, what their options were, and once they got the information, they said, okay, we're good to go.
It looks like jurors may be entering the courtroom just this very moment, so we're going to wait and see exactly how long that process takes. My fear here was that maybe they got stuck, and then maybe there was confusion about whether or not there was indeed a verdict. Okay. We've seen this in other cases where jurors say, oh, yeah, we have a verdict, but it's not unanimous. Here it is. Well, that's not a verdict. I was wondering if we were going to get one of those situations here, or whether or not maybe somebody threw their hands up and said, you know what, I'm the lone holdout. I'm all confused about this. I'm going to go with the rest of you on the majority. And then maybe some party had a fit and said, this reeks of some kind of coercion back in the jury room. I was wondering if maybe that's what they were talking about. Who knows?
We may find out.
Looks like the judge just sat back down. Let's listen. An interesting verdict there, ladies and gentlemen, in the Roy Oliver case in Texas. Guilty of murder for the police officer in the shooting of an unarmed African-American teenager. That's the verdict. Guilty of murder, not guilty of 2 underlying charges. Those 2 underlying charges were aggravated assault with a deadly weapon by a public servant. This sounds, Ronn Blitzer, like a compromise verdict if I've ever seen one, because if you're guilty of murder, generally you're guilty of aggravated assault.
Yeah, this is pretty puzzling. It doesn't seem to make much sense legally, which makes me believe what you just said, that this was a compromise of sorts where the jury said, okay, we're going to get him for murder, but we'll let him off for the other 2.
Yeah, I mean, I could see turning around and saying not guilty of murder because there are more elements to murder, like aggravated assault's down here, murder's up here, and, the other way would have made logical sense, but this way doesn't exactly make logical sense. I mean, it's not really contested that he's a public servant. There's no way they could have hung on that.
Yeah, it's a little weird. You would think that if there was some sort of compromise, they would, as you just said, would say, okay, we're going to convict him on these lesser charges because at least we want to get him with something, but we're not convinced as to the main charge, the murder, so we're not going to go that far. Here, it's the opposite. I'm really confused by this decision. I'm not surprised by the guilty verdict for murder, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, but to get him for murder and not for using the weapon unlawfully, it's really strange.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so look, just to break this down again, folks, we're going to let you know what we're going to keep on top of this afternoon here on the Law and Crime Network. We're being told that the sentencing phase in the Roy Oliver case is going to start in about 15 minutes, and we're hearing that over some of the sobs in the courtroom. Of course, the victim's family is present. There's a lot of crying and hugging occurring in that Roy Oliver courtroom right this moment. The juror's verdict is a little bit confusing legally because, as I said, the aggravated assault charge is a lesser charge, and legally, by the operation of logic, if you're guilty of murder, then you're guilty of aggravated assault. Aggravated assault is a lesser included of murder. We're going to keep on top of this. Bottom line, guilty of murder in the Roy Oliver case in Texas. We will be back to follow the the sentencing phase of this case when we return in just a moment. Welcome back, folks, to the Law and Crime Network. You heard it here live on Law and Crime. Police officer Roy Oliver convicted of murder in the death of a 15-year-old unarmed African-American who was a passenger in a car. The officer had testified he believed the car was headed towards a fellow officer and that his fellow officer's life was in danger. That verdict came down moments ago. We are waiting for a sentencing hearing to pick up in that Roy Oliver case. We're hearing that he could face a possible sentence of anywhere between 5 and 99 years. That's a pretty wide berth. But the headline here is exactly what jurors were doing with this verdict. Guilty of murder, not guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Now, this is legally bizarre because that aggravated assault charge is a lesser included offense to murder. So if they found him guilty of murder, then by logical operation, he should have been automatically guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Ronn Blitzer is just as confused as I am.
Yes. I was just looking at the statute for this lesser charge to see if there was some sort of ambiguous wording that maybe they could have been hanging on. And I'm not seeing anything here. A serious bodily injury to another. I mean, he killed the guy, so that satisfies that. He was a public servant acting under the color of his office or employment. That's what was happening. I'm stumped.
I am as well. You know, I think the key to this may be that moments before we were told that there was a verdict on all 3 charges, the jurors said that they were not unanimous on the justification element. In other words, whether this shooting was justified. So did they just turn around and say, we're not going to sit here and keep beating this back and forth trying to figure out whether he was justified or he wasn't. We'll just split it down the middle and say guilty on the top and then not guilty on the other 2. Is that maybe what happened here?
It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but I have no other explanation here. I think you may be right on this one, just because I can't wrap my head around why else this would have happened.
You know, jury deliberations are a lot like horse trading. And they're supposed to be about whether or not the elements of that statute are met by the facts in the case. And when there's disagreement, we start to see horse trading. And again, we weren't in the jury room. We don't know for sure. But that seems to be like maybe what happened here. And you and I are trying to do what we do, and that's pick through the statute and say, is there an element over here that's not over here? Are these charges incongruent? I see them as congruent.
Yeah. Again, like you said, like we're focusing on the legal elements here. And if you do that, there's only one way to answer this. If you're guilty of the murder, you're guilty of the lesser charges. That's just how it works. Clearly, that's not how the jurors in this case were approaching this. They were not, in my estimation, going by the letter of the law. It was more either some degree of horse trading, like you were saying, or someone just didn't like the idea of this law in the first place. We were discussing this earlier about the whole idea of a separate statute for a public servant committing an assault with a deadly weapon. You know, if someone on the jury just didn't like the idea of piling on an officer just because they're an officer, then maybe they'll be stuck in the mud and saying, no, I'm not going this far.
Yeah, I'll utter the dirty word, and that's nullification. Maybe that's what was going on here. But look, there's no way to tell for sure, folks, unless we hear from a member of the jury. Of course, sometimes we do, and sometimes we interview them here on the Law and Crime Network. That invitation, of course, is always open. But look, if you're just joining us, the Roy Oliver case in Texas, Officer Roy Oliver found guilty of murder in the death of a 15-year-old African-American who was a passenger in a vehicle. Not guilty, though, on aggravated assault with a deadly weapon charges. Those charges carried an enhancer because Roy Oliver was a public servant. Not guilty on those charges, but guilty on murder. That's the verdict from Texas. We are waiting for a sentencing hearing to pick up in that case. It's due to set to begin, I should say, any moment from now. He could face a penalty of a few years all the way up to 99 years in prison. While we wait for that to pick up, let's listen to some of the key testimony in this case. Grant Fredericks was a video analyst. He was tasked with going through the officer's body camera and pointing out frame by frame to those jurors what was happening. That was the verdict that came down just moments ago in the Roy Oliver case out of Texas. Again, the case of a police officer now convicted of murder, but found not guilty of aggravated assault in the death of a 15-year-old African-American who was the passenger in a vehicle that was in the process of fleeing from a scene where officers, including Oliver, were called to investigate reports of underage drinking. While officers were responding to this big party at a house, they heard gunfire that turned out to have been occurring nearby, went outside, and this vehicle started to leave the scene. They ordered that the vehicle stop, and in the process of that vehicle kind of backing up and then trying to take off down a perpendicular road, Officer Oliver opened fire. Jurors issuing this highly bizarre verdict. Generally speaking, if one is guilty of murder, one is automatically guilty of assault. Here, jurors said not guilty of assault, but guilty of murder. Why did they split the difference? That's what we're sitting here trying to figure out as we wait for the sentencing phase in this case to kick off in any moment. The judge is back on the bench. We're waiting for that portion of this proceeding to pick up. Ronn Blitzer, we're trying to make sense of this. The bottom line is we will not have an answer unless one of the jurors speaks.
It could be that the jurors just didn't understand that these charges kind of go together, and they thought maybe this was an either-or. But it could also just be, as we were saying, that they were compromising, that someone didn't want to really throw the book at him, so they figured, okay, I'll go along with the murder, but we'll ease up on him and hope that he won't get as long of a sentence as he might have otherwise.
If I were to guess, I would turn around and say, okay, look, you know, this must have been a minority, perhaps, that didn't want to throw the book at him, because otherwise it would have been the other way around. If most people wanted to let this guy off the hook and a few people wanted to convict, wouldn't they split and say, well, a few of you want to convict, we'll go for the lesser included charge, not the big charge?
Yeah. You know, you make a good point, and that's why this is as confusing as it is. You know, we're trying to come up with some sort of rationale here, try to peek into the jurors' brains, or what could have been one or two jurors' brains who was hung up on this. It could have been that 11 jurors were convinced that he was guilty of murder and the lesser charges and were ready to do that, and one of them was giving them a hard time, and then finally said, okay, as long as we have the murder, we'll just say, okay, fine on the others.
Yeah, I mean, this could have gone out almost an infinite number of ways. We're trying to parse it out and make sense of it because, again, usually aggravated assault is included in murder. So usually murder requires intent to actually kill someone. Some states require premeditation, meaning that you're plotting it out for some time. There's some deliberative effort put into the actual murder. But the bottom line is, you know, murder requires these additional elements. The assault is, in many states, just the imminent unprivileged physical contact or the threat of the unprivileged physical contact, or in some states, it's the contact itself. That's the assault. It's just the physical contact. The bullet left Officer Oliver's gun and struck this 15-year-old victim. That pretty much meets the definition of aggravated assault.
Yeah. You have this special statute here for assault with the weapon, with the police officer, and it's very specialized for this type of circumstance. But to break it down, yeah, if this wasn't a gun case, if this was someone who, you know, say it was a professional fighter who just punched someone to death, and they were found guilty of murder, they'd still be found guilty of the punch that caused it.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, look, they're back in court, folks. Let's listen back in as the sentencing phase in the Roy Oliver case is set to begin. Testimony there in the Roy Oliver penalty phase from Texas from the victim's teacher. Now, we heard the teacher basically say, look, the victim in this case was a great student. He had a great attitude. He helped other students. Wished more students were like the victim in this case, 15-year-old Jordan Edwards. Ronn Blitzer is still along with me here on the Law and Crime Network. We heard the defense object and say, wait a minute, this sort of discussion in a penalty phase of the positive attributes of the victim is inadmissible under Texas law. The judge said, forget it, defense, this is coming in front of the jurors. But, you know, it raises this perennial question as to just how much the victim's attributes are really relevant to what the defendant did.
Yeah, I don't think that they should be able to go this route either. You know, why is this relevant? We're talking about the crime itself. We're talking about the possibly the mindset of Roy Oliver at the time. I know we're going to get into some of his history, his background here to try and play into or you know, color what he did here. But to me, it doesn't matter whether or not Jordan Edwards was this great kid or not. What happened is still what happened.
And we have another teacher taking the stand right now that you can see in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. But we need to take a break in just a minute here on the Law and Crime Network. We are anticipating more of the same out of this particular teacher. Just to recap really quickly, the judge basically saying this kind of testimony can continue in the penalty phase. We'll be right back in a moment. A parade of witnesses here, ladies and gentlemen, in the Roy Oliver penalty phase in Texas. This is the case of a police officer just convicted about an hour ago of murder for the shooting death of 15-year-old Jordan Edwards. We've now heard from 3 teachers of Jordan Edwards saying he was a great student, and this last witness getting into some suppositions, some guessing as to the victim's religious views. Ronn Blitzer, what did you make of that?
You saw me. I was calling objection in the studio here. I
thought you just meant me.
Well, that goes without saying. But where do you draw the line here? This judge doesn't seem to have any kind of line or boundary for what sort of evidence or testimony is going to come in at this hearing here. I understand this is a murder case. You know, we see in other types of cases, whether it's sexual assault, like we saw with Larry Nassar, where you have victim impact statements and you have people going on and on telling their stories. And in a murder case, the victim can't do that. But, okay, you want to have family members or close friends talk about how their lives have been impacted due to their loss of this person. But to have a parade of teachers go on and say, oh, well, he was a good student, or I think he was religious. Come on, like this.
I mean, there's speculation in there. First of all, the speculation thing bothered me more than anything. And then the next question is, you know, how is it relevant to what this defendant did? Because the question is what went on in this defendant's mind.
Yeah, it is completely irrelevant. It's there only to play on emotions. And there, you know, is a line between what is probative, what is of actual value here versus what is purely emotion-based testimony. And that you want to have the parents go on and talk about their story, and they can talk about what kind of a kid he was. I have no problem with that. Give them all the leeway in the world. But to have teacher after teacher come on and do this, I think is way too much.
Okay, you know, this was another case that started out, keep in mind, with the victim's photo up on the judge's bench. Through much of the testimony, there was an objection to that, but the photo remained.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on with this judge. I have no problem with the guilty verdict here for murder. I predicted it. I would have voted that way myself. But now you're on to sentencing, and there are rules, and I feel like this judge is just tossing them all out the window.
Well, I'm certainly wondering exactly what those rules say at this moment, Ron. So, look, we're going to bring you back to more live testimony from the Roy Oliver penalty phase in Texas when we return here on the Law and Crime Network. Actually, we're going to go back to court. I'm hearing to listen into this next witness.
That I would